I'm here to talk a little bit about the problems with Europe, the EU circus, a little bit, very short update about the Brexit as far as I know, and then a little bit about the pros and cons for private operators, including businesses with corporate jets flying in and out of the EU. See if I can get this to work. The EU circus, and then with a little Union Jack in the corner, because you guys are definitely contributing right now. Why is it such a mess in Europe? If you compare it to the United States, they have 50 states in the Union over there. They have the same language though, they have the same currency, they have more or less the same legislation, and it's been going on for more than 200 years. In Europe, this came into existence in the 60s and the 70s. We have 28 different member states right now. Once they leave, there will be fewer, of course. But one of the biggest problems actually is that we have 24 official languages. You know, in a lease contract, aircraft lease contract, it usually says that if it's bilingual, that maybe the English version has preference over another language, if there's any doubt about the understanding of the lease contract. Not so in the EU. All 24 official languages have the same validity. So when I look at a law text from the EU, in Danish, there might be something in there that's not directly translatable into English or French. My usual example is we have a saying for a period starting at midnight and lasting for 24 hours. We call that a døgn. Now, let me hear an English guy say that. That's even more impossible. A døgn. The English saying, I guess, is a 24-hour period that starts at midnight. That's just a stupid example, but that's the way it is. One very famous case that went before the European Court of Justice was the Finnish case, AOY. It was a case where a company in Finland bought 2 Falcon jets in France and imported them into Finland for use partly privately, but partly on an AOC. And the whole question before the courts was this aircraft delivered to an airline or was it used by an airline? The two terms were used differently in the different member states' legislation. In the end, it ended up by being used by an airline, meaning that the previous links to the factory, they sold it, I believe, to company A and then to company B, and there was a lease agreement, and then was used by an AOC holder, which actually also was a charter operator. And they decided that the term used by was correct, and thus all the member states that were using the delivered to saying or sentence had to change the law, including Finland. So the guy with the airplane actually won. Yay. But that's a huge problem in the EU. There's more interpreters and translators working in the EU than any other specific group of people. Despite that, or on top of that, we also have like different currencies. It's only 19 members of the Eurozone. Denmark is not a part of it. The UK is not a part of it. Sweden has the krona, Poland has the zloty, Croatia has still the kuna, Romania, Bulgaria, all sorts of different currencies. That also complicates the matters. We also have different cultures. In Greece, they have another alphabet. That doesn't make it any easier, for sure. So that's partly why it's so really complicated to understand why flying in the EU is difficult. Because, basically, all the rules are supposed to be the same. In reality, they're interpreted in different ways. Some are doing it on purpose because they want to create sort of a loophole or a tax haven and administer the laws differently as to their liking to benefit the companies that are situated in their country. And some of them just doesn't get it. Like right now we're hearing the Portuguese authorities are asking people coming in to buy fuel for an EORI number, which is a registration if you want to engage in trading. Of course, you can argue that buying fuel is trading, at least for one part, the seller, but that's not how it's meant to be. So that's simply a clear misunderstanding on behalf of the Portuguese authorities. Brexit England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man, they may leave, they may not. Most people outside of the UK are not aware that the referendum 3 years ago was actually the second referendum. So when people are arguing that we should have a referendum now on a more educated level, it would actually be the third. And that kind of undermines people's, the exit, what do you call it, the levers, when they say, no, people voted. So they had their say, now we have to live with it. Because again, in 1975, two-thirds of the voters actually decided to stay in. So it's actually a third referendum if they were asked again. Personally, I don't see any problems with asking people again. There will definitely be a more educated vote by now. But I guess those that don't want it might be afraid of the outcome, and I think maybe if they had a vote, I think it would be the same. Because basically people were fed up with politicians, and that may be why it ended up the way it did. Anyway, that's part of the EU circus for sure. A little bit of a cartoon here with Theresa May. She's no longer the leader of the Conservative Party. She's still the PM for time to come. Maybe there will be an election. We'll see. In France, they have their own issues, and like in Greece, they're just rebuilding the whole nation back from the very old days. Lawmaking in the EU is more or less the same way as Montesquieu anticipated back in the 1800s. There's a division of power. We have the European Parliament together with the Commission, who are making the laws, adapting the laws. The Council, and then the Commission are implementing it, and then we have the European Court of Justice, who's deciding if it's done in a correct way or not. And that's a really, really important point to understand, that the European Court of Justice in the end will have the final say. Is this law to be interpreted this way or that way? And the EU Commission might very well be wrong, even though they are the EU government. Many of you may have heard about Regulation 261 in Europe. If you're flying regularly, I believe most people are, then at least you should know it from a passenger point of view. Regulation 261 is the regulation that entitles you as a passenger to compensation if the airline doesn't perform. Let's say you are 3.5 hours late on arrival, then you are actually allowed a compensation for the airline being late. That's all governed by Regulation 261. When Regulation 261 came out, the EU Commission made a white paper and said this is what is called extraordinary circumstances, which relieves an airline of liability. Of course, the airlines were looking into that and said, how can we get out of paying compensation in the amount of 400 or 600 euros per passenger to 180 passengers or 300 passengers? A lot of manpower from a legal point of view was, allocated to find out loopholes. The Commission came out with a recommendation. These are deemed to be extraordinary circumstances, like a bird strike or a regular strike or something hitting the airplane, an FOD. In the end, the European Court of Justice, for the most of it, just kicked all of that out. So in the end, the EU Commission actually had to repeal their guidelines, because the EU Court of Justice overruled all of that. So bear in mind, the EU Commission guidelines, the working papers, the white papers, what they come out with, including the Tax Committee and the Customs Committee, that may be overruled by the Court of Justice. We have covered that. I only have 20 minutes, so I have to expedite here. One example of the circus, say you have an aircraft that's predominantly used for business. Some member states might apply the rules in an incorrect fashion. EU VAT, value-added tax, is governed by the VAT directive. A directive is a framework for the national member states to implement their local VAT law. Now, they may do that in a wrong fashion. We did it in Denmark, they did it in the UK. You guys probably remember the 8-ton rule where you could import an aircraft at 0% VAT. We had sort of the same anomaly in Denmark, where all aircraft were exempt for VAT unless it was a sporting aircraft, which meant that anything that could fly upside down, you'd have to pay VAT. That was clearly not in line with the EU, and eventually we had to change that. But that was back then. We have a case recently, some years back, maybe you read about it, Lewis Hamilton. It was found out by the Paradise Papers when they dug that all out of not Applebee's, but Applebee's files, and found out that Lewis Hamilton had a business jet that he set up through an Isle of Man company and then declared that he would like to use it privately also. And since you're only allowed to reclaim all of the V if you are using it 100% for business use to begin with, then that was clearly out of line. Now we're still waiting for the Treasury report. Maybe the Isle of Man guys know a little bit more about that, but it should be coming this year, but maybe they're too busy with the Brexit. Some member states allow very flexible use of the rules. We've seen it in Netherlands, we've seen it in Malta and Cyprus. That eventually might stop because the EU Commission is really beefing up on the inspections. Another example is delayed implementation of rules. It has been more or less the rule for a long time that a lessee cannot reclaim import VAT for an aircraft that they do not own because they don't have the burden of financing the airplane. Now that has been very delayed in most EU member states, but that's still ongoing, and they are looking at strengthening it. So eventually a lessee option to import and pay the VAT and reclaim it might disappear. If they do it anyway, then what will happen? Well, eventually, if a member state doesn't come, not online, but if they don't line up with the way the rules are supposed to be, like Denmark did, like the UK did when they changed the 0% rules, then they're left to have a case where they are breaching the treaty. So Denmark will be indicted, brought before the EU Court of Justice, and then they'll be decided. Now, if that turns out to be correct by the Commission and incorrect by, say, Denmark, then all the customers that benefited from this, then they might go after those guys. So it's kind of complicated, but that's the way it is. Brexit, very short update. I've been asked, why do you guys care? Why can't we just leave? And it's it takes two to get a divorce, So I think what they came up with the agreement is that the Brits are going to pay 69 billion pounds. So that's part of the divorce agreement, right? 39. Okay, I turned it around. So anyway, a whole lot of money. So the Brexit date right now is October 31st or earlier if the Parliament will approve the withdrawal agreement as it has been agreed. I don't see a conclusion coming up. It may be that they will have an election, and that might give a clue as to what will happen or not. Theresa May, she stepped down. She'll stay on as PM until a replacement has been found. I think it's very safe to draw a conclusion, and the conclusion is that nobody can draw a conclusion. So we'll just have to wait and see. Not even the Brits know. So what will happen airplane-wise if the Brexit is cancelled? It's business as usual. We'll just do as we have done so far. With a soft Brexit or hard Brexit, it depends on the deal. And if there's no deal, then the UK will be like a third country outside of the EU. So it'll be treated the same way, customs-wise, as North America or Africa or the Far East or whatever. If you have an airplane that's already been imported, it'll be grandfathered. That's my best opinion. So you shouldn't have to worry. For the future, if you fly into Europe and you have a Brexit, then mainland Europe, the EU, you'll still have to do your thing there, but now you'll also have to do your thing in the UK. So it'll just be like any other country, like Switzerland, for example. So it shouldn't really be a big deal. You just have to navigate through it. Here is a link. The whole slide, the presentation is available on our website. You can download it. I'm not going to go through all of that, but that's where you find more stuff, more info about this. So what can you do right now if you fly into Europe? You can import or you can admit your airplane. The difference between full importation and temporary admission, popular speaking, is like if you buy a ticket to a movie theater, it's implied that you're going to leave again, right? So you're admitted into the theater to watch this movie, and as soon as the movie stops, you leave again. An importation would be like if you go into a movie theater, you set up camp down in front of the big screen. Now, it's maybe a stupid analogy, but at least for the temporary admission, kind of makes sense. There are two ways of importing or admitting your airplane into the EU. You can fully import, or you can fly in and leave again. That's called temporary admission. Most people tend to think there's a third option of doing nothing. Doing nothing is actually a temporary admission. Just by crossing the border with your airplane, you are saying to the authorities, I'm temporarily admitting my airplane. I hereby vow that I will stay within the temporary admission regime. That's what the airlines do every day. When Emirates fly from Dubai to Hamburg twice a day, they're temporarily admitting that airplane into the EU. When they leave again, it's done. Just to cut it real short, we've done some, like a frequently FAQ, frequently asked questions, a list of pros and cons. So this could be a little practical exercise. How the aircraft is imported or admitted, be aware that value-added tax is between 15 and 25% of the value of the aircraft, so this has to be taken seriously. If you do a full import, you don't really gain anything above temporary admission, but on the other hand, there are a lot of stuff that you need to be certain that you are adhering to the rules. A lessee cannot import the aircraft, only the real owner can do it. It must be used for correct economic activity, minimum for the 5 first years. It's really complicated. It comes with a huge potential VAT liability if you are not staying within the limitations of what you're doing. And you risk ending up in a situation where the import is looked at differently from country to country, and you may have to adapt contradictory rules. So, for example, the tax authorities are looking at commercial versus private, whereas we in aviation look at commercial and private flying, where private flying includes business use. That's very contradictory to how a taxman actually thinks. So, an FAQ sample here. The CEO is using the aircraft for entertainment, hobby, commuting, or personal recreational travel. How is that treated? Full importation, that must be handled correctly worldwide. If an aircraft is used in South America for private travel, that actually has an effect on the VAT handling in Europe. If you reclaim the VAT upon import in Europe, they don't care if it's only flying in Europe or it's flying in South America. At all times, this aircraft must be used 100% for business use. If you're using it privately, now I contradict that what I'm saying, but if you're using it privately, that's allowed if you pay for it, just like a charter. Must be handled and paid directly to the importer. Imputed income won't work. Civil values are often way too low for the taxman in Europe. So you can't do that. Like the example with Lewis Hamilton, where he was using the aircraft privately, that's perfectly fine if he paid his own company for the use of the airplane. Now, mind you, the tax authorities don't care about the privileges and traffic rights aviation-wise. So, if that was black charter, if he did that to himself or flew with himself or his family, that's a different thing. Tax guy doesn't care about that. If you look at temporary admitting an airplane like that, he can fly unlimited non-business use because that's what the whole theme, the whole scheme of temporary admission is meant for. As long as there's no ticket paid or direct payment allowed for the individual seat. And no commercial freight, that's more or less irrelevant. Can you fly from Paris to Hamburg? That's often a question we hear about temporary admission and full import. Can you fly internally in Europe? Unlimited travel is allowed with a full import. There are no restrictions. Same thing with temporary admission. Unlimited travel allowed inside the EU for a period of 6 months at a time. If you come in, you have 6 months, you can leave again. That's private. If it's commercial, like Emirates, they can come in, and once they're done doing their business, they have to leave again. So they don't have 6 months, they have until conclusion of their business. With Emirates, it's kind of a stupid example. Let's take a charter operator out of Dubai. He flies in, he stays for 4 days in London, then he flies to Hamburg, and he stays there for 3 days, then he can leave again. That's perfectly fine. Can you rent a hangar? Well, if it's fully imported, you can do as you want, because the airplane is treated exactly the same as if it was owned by an EU company. So if Harrods in London buys an airplane and they set up a hangar in Luton, you, as a Dubai entity or Pacific South Asia, you can do that as well. Not a problem. Temporary admission, you cannot stay permanently. It's like the movie theater analogy I came up with. You have to leave again when the show is over. So you cannot have a fixed base. You can stay for 6 months, but if you're actually hiring a hangar, setting it up in Luton and hire an apartment for 3 months for your pilots, that may be considered an establishment, and then you can no longer use temporary admission. So just beware of the restrictions, but otherwise temporary admission is fine. Can we take EU resident colleagues from London to Milan? With a full importation, yes, no restrictions. With temporary admission, yes, no restrictions. That is a very common misunderstanding, that you cannot carry EU people on board. You can. Can you hire EU resident pilots? With full importation, yes. With temporary admission, yes. However, it's a precondition that the EU resident pilot are directly employed by the customs declarant on the forms, if you use a form, or otherwise the guys that are responsible for the airplane. This one and the previous one, if you can carry EU people on board, that's kind of the root for the misunderstanding. Because when we asked the EU Commission, said, who is benefiting from a charter? Who is benefiting from a flight from A to B? Is that the owner? Is that the passengers? Or is it the pilot? Well, I guess most of you guys would agree with me, it's the guy in the back. He ordered the flight, he's in it, he's benefiting from it. He needs the transport from A to B. But in fact, when it comes to the temporary admission regime based on the Istanbul Convention, they actually look at the pilot. Stupid as it may be, but they're looking at the pilot. And that's where the rumor about EU resident people on board is not allowed. That is correct. You cannot have an EU resident pilot on board unless he's directly contracted by the owner to do this. But if he is, then it's without a problem. I'm right there. 2 more minutes. So, conclusion, full importation, the pros, full importation will give you all the necessary flight privileges for a typical private operator. The cons can have a huge economic effect if it's done incorrectly. There's a potential liability as well. Temporary admission, the pros, temporary admission will give all the necessary flight privileges for the typical private non-EU based operator. Mind you, it has to be non-EU. And the cons, there are none. We saw a question up here in the previous presentation. Can you use a foreign registry and use temporary admission? Isle of Man and Channel Islands are deemed to be within the EU customs territory. So if you have a Manx or Channel Island registered airplane and it's not fully imported, you're not allowed to fly in the EU or into the EU. Not even a single flight in and out. That is illegal. You risk getting your airplane impounded if you do so. Other flags of convenience can be used. Cayman Island, Tango 7 out of San Marino, Bermuda, or any other non-EU registry. If it's based outside, operate outside, owned outside and registered, then temporary admission is fine. You can check the details yourself. All this that I said now is available, documented thoroughly on our website, so feel free to visit our website and seek more information or ask questions.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, you've got 2 questions on Slido. One, deceptively simple. So, in summary, are owners paying VAT or not?
They're not.
Okay, nice short answer. And
Yep.
one from the earlier panel, for the registry panel, someone asked, for each of the registries, do aircraft registered with you, this is the registry, qualify for temporary EU or importation or need to be fully imported?
I think you were busy doing the questions because I already answered
I heard
that,
you.
correct?
I heard you. And I know you answered it, but do you want to just comment quickly again?
Yeah. For the four guys sitting up here, the Aruba and the, what is it, the fourth one?
Guernsey, T-Reg.
Guernsey and Isle of Man, it's a no-go for temporary admission. If it's fully imported, you're good. The other two can do both.
Great. Any more questions? Yep, Nilesh.
We have quite a few Asian customers who spend a lot of time in Europe, especially UK. I say everybody who owns a global owns a home in London. So question is, for people buying now with the Brexit coming in, how does it impact them if they spend 6-7 months a year in Europe and travel between London and Europe? Does it make a difference what registry they put in or whether they import?
Well, if Brexit happens as we think it will be, then the UK and London will be outside of the EU. So how you would have your airplane in the UK would be up to British guys. But flying from the UK to mainland Europe, that would be like going anywhere else in the world. So you could use temporary admission or full import, either way.
Thanks.
Any more questions? Thank you very much.